If you read the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention, you can see that in the first few weeks, they were building the platform or the framework for a mega government. They were going to have a House of Representatives elected by population, a Senate elected by population. Senators were going to serve for 7 years. The president was going to be elected by Congress and serve by 7 years. The federal government was going to be able to do anything it wanted so long as the states were incompetent in that area. I mean, they were building. Something happened, and I can pinpoint the day. It was July 17, 1787, when that began to change. If that had never changed, if they had gone to the people with the Constitution that they were putting together before July 17, there's no way it would have been ratified.
So we spend a lot of time talking about politics. Those politics, well, they're based on ideas. If we do it right, those ideas are written down from these philosophers, but they're then put into laws, and where the law and the philosophy, it all gets kind of messed up, at least to me. Fortunately, I've got Rob Natelson, who keeps me on the steady. You run our Constitutional Center. Thank you for being here, and thanks for always explaining the history of our Constitution.
Pleasure to be back with you, John.
Why have you dedicated your life to the study of the Constitution? What is it about this that brings you such passion?
Well, one reason is that I believe in freedom, and freedom requires the rule of law. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. It's not always followed, but the rule of law requires us to follow the supreme law of the land until it's amended. So in order for us to follow it, people have to understand it. The other thing is, I love the process by which it was created. The people who put it together and the people who persuaded the public to adopt it were individuals who truly did what you just implied, brought together philosophy and practice and made something new. And it's an exciting story, it's an inspiring story, and it's one of which every American can be proud.
You have the skill to bring the history and the technical bits of it together to really make it, I mean this in a complimentary sense, a living document. How's that? So let me start large. What makes the American Constitution so unique at the time it was written? When we look at it now, it's an old document. At the time it was written and adopted by the people of this country, why was it so special? I try to explain this you won't get this at all because you listen to bad music. But when I try to tell my kid, no, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was so revolutionary. It was only made on a 4-track deck, and it blew apart every recording technique ever known, and it changed pop music forever. And my daughter goes, yeah, but, Taylor Swift. All right, so why was this so different at the time? I said, you have to listen to Sgt. Pepper as if it's 1967. When this was written, why was it so revolutionary?
Well, one reason was one that you just alluded to. The American people approved it. Now, I know it wasn't a perfectly democratic process. I know that many people were disenfranchised, but still it was probably up to that date the greatest exercise of popular democracy in the world. A very wide franchise of people, which, by the way, in some states at least included women and African Americans, voted for delegates whose sole job was to decide whether to adopt or to reject the Constitution.
Didn't they have that in Greece 2,000 years before?
Well, they didn't adopt a constitution in Greece. So part of it was the way it was adopted. And by the way, the Greek voter lists were more narrow. I mean, as a portion of the population than the American voting lists were. But the other reason is that it was probably the most complete constitution ever adopted. It was not the first written constitution. There had been an earlier written constitution in Sweden, and there had been two in the Cromwell era of England, but they were kind of spotty affairs. This was really the first national constitution written in a kind of comprehensive way that it was, and of course it's lasted a good long time.
From what I know, what makes it unique, it wasn't the government, it wasn't a document that said, the government does this, 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 that. It was something that said the human being is sovereign. The job of the government is to protect people's sovereignty. And in order to do this, government is a necessary evil. And we're going to split it up in a way to keep it under control. And that was what's so wild about it. It said the government, the federal government, can only do these limited things. Everything else is left to the states, left to the people, and it can't do anything else but these. And we're going to break apart the powers so that they're self-checking, so that we don't have a tyrant. How'd I do on that?
You did very well. Let me put it in additional context for you. The founders were heirs to a tradition that actually went back to the year 1100 that was pretty unique to Great Britain, or more specifically to England. And that tradition was a tradition of writing down constitutional-style documents, basic documents that limited government power, or more precisely, limited the government of the king. The first one was a charter issued by Henry I. The second one, and probably the most famous, is Magna Carta. But there were others like the English Bill of Rights and the Habeas Corpus Act and so forth. But they were basically documents that limited the power of the king and recited the rights of Englishmen. The American Constitution did, in fact, take that to a new level and said, we the people are the source of all power. We're not simply going to limit some sovereign king whose power comes from some outside source. We the people are the source of the power, and we're going to give the government certain limited responsibilities. And within those limited responsibilities, we're going to, as you just said, provide multiple checks to ensure that personal liberty endures.
You've been doing this for decades.
About 30 years.
And you've gone back to England, you've seen the original documents, you wear the white gloves in the library, and and so you're basically Indiana Jones, but for the Constitution. You write for the Epic Times, and you've been doing this detailed series on all the founders.
Yeah.
And these are the guys at the convention who fought to include this, to include that. I want to go over some of these founders because we know some of the names. I don't know all these names. You know all these names. How long did it take these guys to do the process? You know, we see the big picture. We see the painting. You know, there it is.
Yeah.
And of course, that is a fictitious painting, but it gives us pride. How long was the process, start to finish?
In a sense, John, it was centuries, dating back to 1100, right?
That's a mom answer right there.
No, it's an important answer because there's a myth out there, and I think I ingested this myth somewhere in school, that 55 guys got together and they kind of popped the Constitution out of their own heads. By the way, there's another myth kind of on the other side, which is often promoted by conservatives, which was that it was all a flash of divine lightning.
And God came down.
Yeah, right, exactly. These were fallible human beings, but they were relying upon centuries and centuries of practice. Now, to come to your specific question, how long were they actually?
To get to your point, let me interrupt my own thought there, which was when you said that you had Magna Carta, you had the other Henry VIII, I am, that we call that natural law, and so that the English.
Now, that's not natural law, John.
But there was a tradition of people bumping into each other and organizing, hey, you stole my stuff. No, you didn't. People started having this system of, well, we're all going to live together. How do we do this? This is mine, that's yours. No, that's mine, that's yours. And over time, the English especially built up these laws called natural law, which also then kind of interpreted into part of American law as well. Am I wrong on this? I stumbled on how to explain that.
I think what you're looking at is common law.
Common law.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And common law did, in fact, get a lot of its inspiration from natural law sources. Let me explain a term here quickly. The phrase common law actually has multiple meanings. Probably the most common meaning is that body of law that was built up by certain courts in England over many years. But there is a broader meaning, which is to say the law that was common to all England, and that did in fact absorb a lot of natural law elements. That the judges who applied common law, they'd studied their Aristotle, they'd studied their Plato, and they drew inspiration. In fact,
from the same thinkers you were talking about?
From some of the same thinkers.
Okay.
Before I started this series on the founders that we're talking about today, I wrote a series for the Epoch Times called Ideas That Form the Constitution. And it actually had a series of 22 articles discussing these individuals whose thought went into the founders' thought.
Thus going back 1,000 years.
Yeah, actually going back well over 2,000 years.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So when I said, how long did this party last? You could say thousands of years, goes back to that series. If I were to be more pedestrian and say, how long was this meeting? How long was the meeting?
It was called to order on May 25th, 1787, and it adjourned on September 17th of 1787. So
a long meeting.
Yeah, a long meeting. I mean, it was a big job.
How ugly did it get?
It only really got ugly once. One of the delegates got kind of hot-headed and said, if the big states don't treat us small states well, we will look abroad and seek help from people who are more faithful friends. Basically a threat that they would form an alliance with Britain or with France. And that was Gunning Bedford. And he got chastised pretty good for that.
How big of a question, and this is a topical one, how big of a question was slavery? Because it has dogged us ever since.
Yeah, it was a pretty big question. Contrary to popular belief, most of the founders, including even those founders who owned slaves, were opposed to slavery. They viewed it as contrary to natural law and something that hopefully was going to die out. They did not foresee the invention of the cotton gin. So they saw their task as, well, how do we deal with this in the period of time before it dies out? 3 states insisted upon being able to continue the slave trade, at least for a while, and so the Constitution was written to allow the slave trade for another 20 years, after which Congress could abolish it, which, by the way, Congress did by an overwhelming margin at the earliest possible date.
Really?
Yeah.
Not slavery.
Not slavery, the slave trade, the African slave trade. But you had people like James Madison, who, although he had slaves himself, felt locked into the system, favored gradual emancipation laws. You had people like George Washington, again a slaveholder who, as he went on through life, came to hate slavery more and more and freed all of his slaves by his will and made provision for education and for training of the younger ones and annuities for the elder ones. You had people like John Dickinson who, during their lives, freed their slaves. So what defense there was at the convention was very, very tepid and was basically a matter of, well, John Rutledge said, the fact is, if you want an American Union, you simply can't abolish slavery or even the slave trade in this document. Now, it was a very hard decision for many of the delegates to give up the idea of abolishing slavery in favor of the Union. However, they recognized something which is often forgotten today. They knew the history of Europe. They knew that over the prior centuries, Europe, which was politically fragmented, had engaged in horrible wars. that war racked the continent. In one war, for example, the 100 Years' War, maybe 8 million people on a much smaller population had been slaughtered. Slaves, as the bottom of society, would have suffered from that more than anybody if that had gone on in America. So it was important to keep the Union together in order to preserve peace on the North American continent.
But it was an issue. It was not.
It was an issue.
And the decision was made, in order to make a country, we're going to have to deal with this
We're going to have to deal with
later.
it. We're going to have to compromise with it. But James Madison, for example, expressed the view of many founders when he said he was illustrating how people divide into special interests and factions. And he said, on the mere basis of color, we who profess liberty have created an institution which is despotical as any created by man.
Your series going through these men, we know some of these names. We know of Hamilton, we know of Madison. Who are the most underrated of all these? Because we know that there are some that have musicals. Who are the ones that deserve musicals that have no Broadway musicals?
Well, Hamilton would not be my first choice.
Why not?
Well, because Hamilton played a significant role, and a significant enough role to get an essay in my series. His contributions tend to be vastly overrated, and I think that's largely because of what he did.
You just don't like him because he's black and he knows how to rap.
When I say his contributions were overrated, I'm talking about specifically his contributions to the content of the Constitution. He had great contributions toward the Revolutionary War. He was an aide-de-camp and then later a field commander. He helped Washington get the government off on a stable basis. He was important in securing the ratification of the Constitution in New York, which was a state hostile originally to the Constitution. But in terms of the actual drafting of the document, he did comparatively little. And the reason he did comparatively little is he wanted something so radically different from what most of the other delegates wanted.
What did he want?
He wanted essentially to try to replicate the British monarchy in America without calling it a monarchy.
He wanted titles of nobility, didn't he?
He wanted, not exactly. He wanted a lifetime president, indirectly elected. He wanted a lifetime Senate, indirectly elected. He wanted an assembly, House of Representatives, for 3 years. He wanted the federal government to be able to pass laws over, I believe the quote is, all matters whatsoever, essentially total domination over the states, no real restriction.
So the guy wanted basically a king.
Close to a lifetime monarch, which would be like the Holy Roman Emperor or the King of Poland at the time.
And lifetime senators.
Lifetime senators.
So Bernie Sanders forever.
Which we get anyway, by the way.
Are limited, although we can talk about it some other time, Constitution that says Congress can only do these limited things.
Oh, no.
Roads.
No, he wanted Congress to be...
Whatever you want guys to.
He wanted to... And John Adams had some of this too, although not as extreme as Hamilton. Hamilton basically wanted to replicate the British government in America insofar as he thought people would accept it.
Wow. All right, but you didn't answer my question. If Hamilton doesn't deserve the musical, because just for the, again, I want to make sure people understand. It's not because he hasn't done all these incredible things for the founding of the country, but for the writing of the Constitution, right. His contribution, you believe, is wildly overrated.
Yeah, and by the way, another reason for overrating, is the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are outstanding expositions.
And I thought he had a lot to do with that.
Right, he wrote the majority of them.
Right.
However, what people don't realize is the Federalist Papers, as a political document, largely failed. They were designed to try to persuade New York to elect a majority pro-Constitution people to the ratifying convention, and instead New Yorkers voted overwhelmingly for anti-Federalists to the convention. And in addition, for those of our listeners or viewers who have read the Federalist Papers, you may read them and you'll find they're quite difficult, and you may say, boy, back in those days, people could really read stuff. No, that's not true. The Federalist Papers were mocked as being overly difficult and overly dry. So they served certain purposes, and they're invaluable today. But for their announced purposes, winning elections, they did not succeed. Now, let's come back to your question. I'm going to enter it a little bit from the side here, and to say that Madison deserves the musical. Madison was certainly the single most important individual in the framing of the Constitution and the adoption of the Constitution. Even his contribution, however, is overrated. He didn't write the Constitution. He's not really the founder of the Constitution. The Constitution is loaded with provisions that he opposed, but where Madison deserves the credit is he did the research, a lot of the groundwork, research necessary. He convinced George Washington to come to the convention, helped along with his friend Edmund Randolph. He took the notes at the convention. He remained a player at the convention, a good-natured player, even after his ideas were rejected again and again. During the ratification fight, he was the number 2 guy in Virginia for leading the forces in favor of the Constitution, number 1 being Edmund Randolph. And then finally, as a member of Congress, Madison helped to implement and explain provisions of the Constitution. So he's number 1, as most people would recognize, I think. But there are 2 individuals who are systematically and unfairly underestimated, the most underestimated relative to their performance. One is Edmund Randolph of Virginia, and the other is John Dickinson of Delaware.
All right, thanks. That'll do it. All right, no, why? Tell me why. I've heard the names.
Yeah.
But that's all I've heard. I can't tell you a thing about these 2 guys.
Let's start with John Dickinson. John Dickinson, at one time, was the second most famous American in the world after Benjamin Franklin because of his writings during the colonial era. He had served as president of Pennsylvania. He had served as president of Delaware. He had been involved in the Continental Congress.
They had presidents, not governors, presidents.
No, some of the early constitutions had presidents rather than governors. South Carolina also. And so he was a senior statesman, so to speak, not as much as Franklin, but he was 55 years old, one of the older delegates. And throughout the convention, he repeatedly was ahead of his time. For example, he talked about the senators being chosen by the state legislatures long before others were talking about it, about there being an equal number of senators from each state, about a minimum age of 30 for the Senate, about enumerating the federal government's powers. He talked about all of these things at an early date and actually came up with a plan of government. And he also played the role of helping to calm down all the hotheads and reminding people from time to time that they were not drafting a document based upon their own political fancies. They were drafting a document that would A, work, and B, be acceptable to the American people. I think it's fair to say that without John Dickinson, we would not have a constitution.
Let me kick that back to you. So if I were one of these guys, I would be thinking about my own political bias. And I'd be thinking, how do we protect this interest? How do we keep taxes low? How do we make sure property rights are this way? I'd be thinking about my own, what I think needs to be protected in order to protect freedom. You're saying this guy was a pragmatist and said, we need something that the people are going to ratify in all their states. We need something that will work and something that limits government and actually make sure that we don't recreate tyranny over generations.
Well, the thing about Dickinson is he was a pragmatist, but he was somebody who knew how to balance pragmatism with ideals. He was a lover of the classics, deeply intellectual, and he knew all the great thoughts. And one of his gifts was the ability to bring that down from the stratosphere to earth and actually apply it. A good example of somebody who's sometimes overrated would be James Wilson of Pennsylvania. James Wilson of Pennsylvania had certain idée fixe, some fixed ideas, and when the convention rejected them, he just couldn't get over it. Dickinson, on the other hand, was a much better team worker. The other one I mentioned is Edmund Randolph. Edmund Randolph was a young man, only 33 years old when he was elected governor of Virginia. He had already served a decade as Attorney General of Virginia. He headed the Virginia delegation to the convention. He presented the famous outline of government called the Virginia Plan, which was their basis of discussion for 8 weeks. He played an important role at every stage of the proceedings. And then when the Constitution was about to be signed, he, I think for strategic reasons, decided not to sign it, right? But when the Virginia ratifying convention occurred, and the anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, seemed to have a decisive majority in the Virginia ratifying convention. And when those opponents were led by one of the greatest orators in all history, Patrick Henry, it was Edmund Randolph who was given the primary responsibility of leading the fight for the Constitution. And he won.
Up against Patrick Henry?
Up against Patrick Henry.
Give me liberty or give me death?
That's
Patrick
right.
Henry?
Now, nobody could match Patrick Henry as an orator, but you needed somebody in the same general class, right? Someone who could at least approach him. That was not Madison. Madison was no orator. Someone like John Marshall, who was at the convention, who was a pretty good orator, didn't have the stature. As the governor of the Commonwealth, Edmund Randolph basically was the guy who got that Constitution approved in Virginia. And John, I ask you, what would have happened if Virginia had not approved the Constitution? Well, for one thing, George Washington would not have been eligible to be president, and the Constitution would have been strangled in its cradle. The Union would have been strangled in its cradle.
People want to read these articles you've written, and they don't have, can't get to the Epic Times. Can they read them at the website?
Yes, as a matter of fact, this gives me an opportunity to say that 1 week after each article was printed in the Epic Times, it becomes available at the Independence Institute website. You go to independenceinstitute.org and you click on the Constitution tab.
Just go to thinkfreedom.org, also goes there as well, right. And go to the Constitution tab. It's really, really terrific. Let me keep peppering you with some questions, because I think in your mind, you were there. I have a feeling that you close your mind, you're in the balcony just watching this stuff happen as it unrolls. Tell me about Washington's role in this. How did he get to be in that spot? And could somebody else have done his job at the convention?
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me just say, to pad something that you just said. Yeah, you're right. After 30 years of being in this, I do have a feeling of being acquainted with these men.
Really?
Really.
Do you know them?
And it helps, as you know, that I have a political background. I'm not a pure academic.
You ran for governor of Montana.
I ran for governor of Montana. I actually got
You've been
some
an
votes.
activist on many political battles over
yes.
the years in Montana and in Colorado.
And in addition, I've run my own business. These people had experience in business, they had experience in agriculture, which I don't have. They had an experience in war, in diplomacy, in practical politics, and so forth. Very widespread experience. I can't claim that, but I have more than the usual academic has, and I'm able to, I think, resonate with them fairly well. George Washington was unanimously and immediately elected president of the convention. He was, at that point...
Was he a delegate?
Yes.
Okay.
He was a delegate from Virginia. And he was universally respected. The fact that he came to the convention gave it a gravitas, a seriousness that it might not otherwise have had. Franklin also played that role. The fact that Washington was in the chair most of the time, not all the time, the fact that Washington was in the chair most of the time also kept the delegates on their best behavior.
Why?
Well, because some of these people were hot-tempered, there were some egos involved, but everybody wanted to deport himself well in front of Washington.
Why?
Washington himself was a man who had an ideal character in his mind, an ideal brand or persona, which he labored greatly to fit. And everybody else recognized that he was looking at them through those eyes. So
hold it there for a second,
Yeah.
because I mean, we all hear the stories of Washington. We grew up the great general, the great president. Are you telling me he was a super celebrity as well?
yes, very much so.
Like how? I mean, I know Eisenhower. Eisenhower won Europe. He ended that front of the war. He was a hero, so he could become, and he became president. Both parties wanted him to run as their nominee. And so it's hard for us to think about Washington as a celebrity of the time.
Mm-hmm.
So he was that famous of a man.
Let's start with his physical attributes. Talking about someone who was 6'2", unusually high for that time, powerfully built, and yet extremely graceful, both on horseback and on the dance floor. A certain magnetism. You know, if you look at Washington and the dollar bill, you see this stern. You know, this was as a real individual. This was a truly magnetic individual who knew how to crack a joke, and somebody who was almost a father figure. Secondly, Washington had done something had done it twice. Well, at that point only once. Very rare in history. He had been in command of a victorious army and had given up his power, ceded his power, and gone home. People compared him to the great Roman statesman Cincinnatus, who was called from his plow to lead the troops to save Rome, took the title of dictator for 18 days, defeated the enemy, and went back to the plow. And in fact, Washington was sometimes called the American Cincinnatus. He was also called the American Fabius after the Roman general who fought the war against Hannibal by delaying, by guerrilla tactics. Everybody recognized that Washington was not by nature a great general, but by reason of his self-discipline, his ability to learn from mistakes, his wise judgment, he became a very competent general, and he won freedom for the United States.
So
he had
getting his
several
favor.
reasons for being a
Now,
celebrity.
everyone who worked under Stalin wanted his favor. One, because it's how you got a better job, and it's also how you stayed alive. Are you telling me it was the same thing with Washington?
No.
That's why you wanted to be under his favor and wanted to impress
You
him?
wanted to be in his favor because he represented an ideal to people. And everybody knew he was going to be the first president.
Really?
There was no question about that. I have not yet published my.
Did he know that?
Sure, he knew it.
Okay.
Sure, he knew it. I've not yet published my article on Washington as I have, for example, on Randolph. But one of the points I make in it is that Washington's greatest contributions in constitution making, though, was not at the framing. I mean, other people could have done the job in the chair. For about 20 days, the convention was in the Committee of the Whole, and Washington, through most of that time, wasn't in the chair at all. The chair was held by the chairman of the Committee of the Whole, Nathaniel Gorham from Massachusetts, a former president of Congress, who apparently did a very competent job in the chair. So other people could have done that task. But as president, what Washington did is he implemented or helped implement the Constitution and helped clarify its terms in many ways. Some people claim he kind of stretched his powers. That's not really true. But what he did is he actualized, or he realized, the vision of the Constitution for the president.
If Hamilton's dream came true and there was going to be a presidency for life, the king, would Washington have accepted the presidency?
I have no idea. I don't know. My suspicion is he might have accepted it for a while and then resigned it. And the reason I say that is because, of course, in those days, there was no provision limiting the president to 2 terms. But at the end of 2 terms, Washington said, I've had enough. I'm going home. It's time for somebody else to do this.
until that dirty bastard FDR came back and ruined that wonderful
Yeah,
tradition.
he ruined that tradition.
All right. Another question I had, and then I want to get back to these personalities, but a function. Who called this Constitutional Convention? We had this Article of Confederation. We had these 13 nations kind of working together in this kind of sort of system, which apparently didn't work very well. They're all taxing each other every time you stepped over the border. How did it go from that to, guys, this isn't working? We're going to meet on this day, and we're going to come up with a system that does this. All right, here. It seemed like it was such a mess. Who raised their hand first and got it organized?
Okay,
I know the story of the convention. It seems like, organizing a family vacation is impossible. This seemed undoable.
Yeah, the actual call, and by the term call is a technical word. It means the invitation to meet. The actual call came from the legislature of Virginia at the end of 1786. The process, however, was a little more complicated than that. Virginia called a convention to meet in Annapolis in September of 1786. 5 states showed up at Annapolis. The Annapolis Convention was chaired by John Dickinson. Dickinson worked with Hamilton and worked with Madison, who were also there, on a recommendation, a wider recommendation, saying that what we really need is another convention with a very broad portfolio that can propose a new political system for America. And so the 5 delegations in Annapolis passed this resolution, which was directed at their own state legislatures, and basically said, please call a convention to meet in Philadelphia on the second Monday of May of next year. But it was Virginia that did that first. After Virginia called the convention in late 1786, 6 other states quickly agreed to participate. In the Continental Congress, there was some concern, mostly in New York and Massachusetts, which were hotbeds of anti-federalist thinking, that this convention might go too far and might propose a new government, which in fact it was authorized to do. So there was a snafu in Congress, which led to a compromise resolution whereby Congress said it's the opinion of Congress that would be a good idea to, in fact, for the states to meet to revise the Articles of Confederation, an attempt basically to nudge the convention back down to a narrower requirement, or narrower scope. But Congress had no authority to make recommendations in that respect. And additional states began to sign up, and most of them also gave their delegates complete power to write a new constitution. There is a myth that's grown up that Congress called the Constitutional Convention and that the convention disregarded the scope of the call by creating a new government, but that's not true. The call actually came from Virginia, and almost all the states had power to propose an entirely new government.
Was there then a second revolution? That we had a revolution, we had the Articles of Confederation, and then these states said, forget that, we're just going to go forward and have another country?
Well, to paraphrase Bill Clinton, it depends upon what your definition of resolution is, right? Revolution is. It was not a revolution in the sense that you had a complete upsetting of the order, but it was a revolution in the earlier English sense of the term of a change of government, certainly. Right. I mean, instead of being...
did the Congress, Congress from the Articles of Confederation, did it just disappear? Did they vote themselves out of commission?
Basically. Yeah, when the Constitution was finished on September 17th, 1787, it was sent to Congress, and Congress weighed whether to endorse it or not endorse it. They didn't think they had the authority to endorse it. And so what Congress did by a unanimous vote was pass it on to the states. Because you see, the Constitution was not adopted pursuant to the Articles of Confederation. It was really adopted outside Congress's scope. The best way to understand this, John, is to see what the Articles of Confederation was. The Articles of Confederation was not a government. The Articles of Confederation was a treaty organization. It was like NATO today. And all of the states retained their sovereign powers. This is written in the Articles. They all retained their sovereign powers, except for some very limited ones that they gave to Congress. And when it became clear to most of the states that the Articles of Confederation wasn't sufficient, they did what signatories to a treaty always have the right to do, is to go outside the treaty and to say, you know, we think we need a new arrangement. And that's what they did. What they set up was a true government, one limited to certain purposes, but still a true government.
So they didn't need NATO's permission.
No, they didn't need.
Got it. That makes sense.
Today, the North Atlantic Council is the organization that would be analogous to Congress under the Articles of Confederation.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And of course, Washington didn't run for a third term because he didn't trust the Dominion voting machines.
That's right.
I'm assuming there was no worry that he wasn't going to win a third election.
No, he would win. I think there were a number of things going on with his decision. One is his character, that is to say, the public image that he tried to live up to, was of the person who renounced power when it was time to renounce power. Secondly, he had a premonition that he might not live too much longer. He was, after all, 65 years old, in which men who went, in an era in which men who got past childhood maybe lived to 60. And in addition, I think he really wanted to get out of the hothouse that federal politics had become and return home and be a farmer, which he was a very capable one.
I did not know until Ken Buck, of all people, the congressman, wrote a book about the building, the Capitol building, which was at the base of the Capitol building, right under the dome, right, is the grave for Washington. They built a crypt for his body, and he didn't want it there. Again, I think part of the character, which was, That's
right. That's right. I think my guess as to where they got the inspiration for that is that if you visit St. Paul's Cathedral in London, which is also, a big dome,
right.
The architect of that is built right underneath it, right? And there's his tomb.
When you look at these characters, we need to wind it down. When you look at these characters, these guys who came together, do you find that there is a theme among them? Do you find that overall you look at these guys and they spent those months together and they came up with something that we end up revering? I look at this document, which I believe is wholly disobeyed. That I believe the government that it overlooks now is trampling all over it.
Yes.
That this is a document that says the federal government is limited, and our government is not limited. I would love to see something that says everything that government does, it has to say under which one of these. What is it? Section 8 of Article 1. It has to be under one of these things. It has to tell me. Wait a minute, are you building roads with that? No. Are you coining money? No. Is this a treaty? No. Is this, well, I forget which, but it's just a remarkably small amount of things that Congress has the power to do. And yet it's banning this, enforcing that, and making rules.
We don't want to overstate the limits. I mean, the Constitution didn't just grant powers in Article 1, Section 8, where there are 18 powers. There are enumerated powers all over the document, both given to Congress, given to other branches of government. Nevertheless, the core of what you said is true. It is a limited document, and there has been utter disregard for its limits in recent years, in recent decades, I should say. And this is true of Republican presidents who give more lip service to the Constitution than Democratic presidents.
The idea of these three branches trying to keep the other, one keeps the other two at bay, it sure seems to me that the presidential branch has been winning this battle since FDR.
Yeah.
Agree, disagree?
I think that's right. Especially if you view the presidential branch as not just the office of the president, but that whole
The administrative.
administrative state. And there is some discussion of that at the Constitutional Convention. There was a definite worry that a strong executive could degenerate into a monarchy. And so they put various checks against the president, as you know. What they did not foresee was the growth of the administrative state. Now, it's not true, as some conservatives say, that Congress could never delegate powers to the president. I mean, from the very beginning of the federal government, Congress delegated powers to the president, and that was recognized as okay. But what we have created now certainly bears no resemblance to what they designed and what the Constitution provides for.
We've seen other civilizations. I look at the Roman Empire. We see these great civilizations come and go. With technology, things speed up. How long does this constitutional republic last if, in fact, these three branches cannot keep themselves under control?
This is something that the founders discussed a great deal. In 2005, as you know, I did a great deal of research at the University of Oxford. And while I was there, I made contact with a librarian from the University of St. Andrews up in Scotland. And she said, we've got James Wilson's academic papers here in St. Andrews. James Wilson was from Scotland before he emigrated to the United States, and one of our greater founders. And she said, "Well, you got to come up and look at the James Wilson papers." Well, I didn't get up there for 4 years, but when I finally did, I got them and I photographed them. And one of the things that James Wilson loved as a student was Roman history. He, like the other founders, were fascinated with this question of not so much why did the Roman Empire fall, but why did the Roman Republic fall? Why did the system of checks and balances in the Roman Republic collapse? Why did other ancient republics collapse? So they built into the Constitution as many of the checks that they thought were consistent with effective government. And if you think about it, the Constitution lasted in all of its vigor for a good 150 years, Civil War aside, right? It wasn't until well into the 20th century that the fabric began to break down with this growth of the administrative state that you talked about before. I don't have a prediction as to how long things can last on their current trajectory. I believe personally that we are functionally no longer a democratic republic. I believe that we're now an oligarchy. That's my view.
Say a little bit more about that.
But whether that will continue to be the case, I don't know. Well, people talk about the deep state, the political class, and so forth. These are in fact the people who run things, and they run things without much regard to what the people want. I'll give you two examples. Something like 85% of the American people would like to see term limits on Congress. Something like 70% of the American people would like to see a balanced budget amendment. Those numbers have been stable now for about 50 years, and yet they don't happen because the political class doesn't want them to happen, and because the states have not used their power under the Constitution to force an amendments convention. When you have a situation like that where fundamental questions, like whether the federal government can run a deficit, where the people's view on those fundamental questions are simply disregarded, not for a period of a year or two or a decade or two, but for 50 years, you realize that you're really not living in a democratic republic anymore. It's not exactly an autocracy yet, but it is an oligarchy. And it's not a closed oligarchy. People, if they go to the right schools and make the right contacts, they can get into it. But it is nevertheless an oligarchy.
I'll add just a quick thought to that. For me, it's when you see your love of the Constitution, my bug is of economics and monetary theory. And I look at the exact same issues of a political class that's out of control mixed with fiat currency and debt, which is also out of control, and that these two have met, and it's unsustainable.
Yes.
You know, at some point, and America being the most stable currency on the planet, and ours is still unsustainable. You know, so at some point it goes. All right. If you could go back and you could have a beer with any one of these guys that you've studied, I'm talking good long beer, nobody else is around, just sitting by the fire, which one?
That's a hard choice. I have to give you two. One would be Madison and one would be Dickinson. Well, simply because of their very significant roles and the way they were able to take, as I mentioned before, ideas and philosophical notions and apply them to practical governance. You know, Dickinson had enjoyed a long political career. Madison had a long political career ahead of him. He was to become president of the United States. So these were very practical men, but they were also men of ideas. People like that are pretty rare, you know? Most people are either one or the other. These folks were both.
Give me that one moment. You know, in the things that I love, the stupid little things that I love, and the stories that I love. I'm a big Beatles fan, for instance. And I think about if the Beatles did not meet their manager, George Martin, who owned the shop that they would go in and listen to the records. With that one weird guy, they never would have managed. If they didn't if they didn't get assigned to George Martin, no, I'm sorry, if they didn't meet Epstein, they wouldn't, their manager, if they didn't get George Martin, their producer. I mean, a couple of little weird things, nothing would have happened. What is that weird twist of luck? You know, if Dick James Music didn't hand Elton John this one letter from a lyricist, he never would have met his lyricist, and they never would have had this great partnership. What is that weird little bit of twist that, you know, two guys who bumped into each other, or the weird thing that happened that made the Constitution?
Well, you know, John, there are a number of them, but I'm going to mention one that I've never been able to fully get my hands or brains around. If you read the proceedings of the Constitutional Convention, you can see that in the first few weeks, they were building the platform or the framework for a mega government. They were going to have a House of Representatives elected by population, a Senate elected by population. Senators were going to serve for 7 years. The president was going to be elected by Congress and serve by 7 years. The federal government was going to be able to do anything it wanted so long as the states were incompetent in that area. I mean, they were building. Something happened, and I can pinpoint the day. It was July 17, 1787, when that began to change. If that had never changed, if they had gone to the people with the Constitution that they were putting together before July 17, there's no way it would have been ratified. I mean, people just would have said, not this. On July 17, sanity began to permeate the brains a little bit more. You're not going to get this sort of thing through unless you water it down, unless you limit the power of the federal government, unless you limit the term of the president, or at least reduce it from 7 to 4 years, unless you do other things to make this government more democratic, more Republican, and less, quote, high-toned, that's their term. And so what you see after July 17 is a process by which the powers are enumerated rather than being given, you know, in gross. The terms are shortened. The government is made somewhat more democratic. The position of the states is strengthened and so forth. Centrists like Dickinson, like Roger Sherman, like Randolph, played central roles at this time in turning the Constitution into something more like what we had when it came out of the convention.
So are you telling me that these guys that, as a limited government man, these guys that I revered were actually just power-hungry politicians who wanted
No,
government to
not
go
at
everywhere,
all.
and then they had an epiphany?
Not at all, but remember, all of them had grown up under the British flag. Many of them admired the British government, although that admiration had its limits. And so a principal model, not the only, but a principal model for them was Great Britain. So what was the model in Great Britain? Well, a hereditary monarch, right? A hereditary House of Lords, and a House of Commons elected for 7-year terms, and a unitary government. A government could do pretty much anything. So the Constitution, as it was shaping up before July 17, didn't go anywhere near that far, and certainly not as far as Hamilton wanted. But it still was a relatively, centralized big government document. And the American people never would have ratified that in a million years.
Independence is so honored to house the scholarship you do on this. It's just really great to have it right there at thinkfreedom.org under the hit Constitution, and you can read these articles that you write for Epoch Times.
Thank you, John, and I'm honored to be part of the Independence Institute.
And I love to tell people I wrote them for you, and I'm glad I could.
Well, you did.
I'm glad I could ghostwrite the stuff for you, and the paper really loves this stuff. Epoch Times asked you to write a couple of these things, and then they kept coming back and say, "You got to write more. You got to write more.
Yeah.
You got to write more."
Yeah,
people love them.
They're printing them all in the print edition, and that's what they want from me.
They make it look really regal. They put them together in collections.
Right. They took one series called the Defending the Constitution series and made an elaborate pamphlet out of it. Whether they'll do that with this series, I don't know.
And then, of course, you can read these all at Epoch Times, but then you have to pay for a subscription, and who can do that? So you can always get them at thinkfreedom.org, Constitution.
Right.
Or get the nice paper ones if you still like the feel of newspaper.
Right.
But people who read like that.
Yeah, they're available 1 week after they're published in the Epoch Times at thinkfreedom.org, or if you prefer, independenceinstitute.org.
And for those of us,
just click on the Constitution.
And those of us who can't read, call you up and you will read them to you over the phone.
That's coming, John.
That's coming soon. Stay tuned for that. Rob, thank you. Thank you. If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.